They imagined an army so vast, so confident, that it could conquer a continent in a matter of weeks. They envisioned its steel spearheads shattering an enemy they utterly underestimated, an enemy dismissed as racially and militarily inferior. Instead, that army would itself shatter, plunging into a frozen hell of its own making. Few moments in the annals of warfare reveal such a direct line from hubris to catastrophic downfall as Operation Barbarossa. This is the story of more than a failed campaign. It is an exposure of the fatal flaws, the deep-seated prejudices, and the strategic arrogance that doomed Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union from the moment the first boot crossed the border. The plan was built on an illusion of swift, decisive victory. The reality was something else entirely. Endless plains that swallowed divisions whole, autumn rains that turned roads into impassable quagmires, and a winter so brutal that it froze weapons solid and stopped engines cold. Men learned that faith could not be armored. The German high command had meticulously planned for a war of weeks, but they found themselves trapped in a war of attrition against distance, against climate, and against a people who refused to break. Was the Führer truly insane to believe he could conquer Russia? Or were there fatal, yet avoidable miscalculations embedded in the very foundation of the plan? The evidence suggests a blindness not born of madness, but of ideology, a profound failure to comprehend the true nature of the land and the spirit of the opponent they sought to annihilate. And as the first shots were fired on June 22, 1941, one question loomed, unanswered. What was the single greatest blind spot in this grand design for conquest?
In the summer of 1940, a fragile, unnatural quiet had settled over Eastern Europe. It was the quiet of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an unholy marriage of convenience between two ideological nemeses. For 10 months, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had been partners in the dismemberment of Poland, their foreign ministers toasting one another while the world held its breath. But this was a pause, not a peace. Beneath the veneer of cooperation, the foundations for the largest land invasion in human history were being laid. For Adolf Hitler, the pact was never more than a strategic delay, a cynical maneuver to secure his eastern flank while he dealt with France and Britain. The ink on the treaty was barely dry when his true, unyielding obsession reasserted itself. It was an obsession born from the darkest pages of his manifesto, Mein Kampf. A fever dream of empire he called Lebensraum, living space. He envisioned a vast agrarian German colony stretching to the Ural Mountains, its Slavic populations exterminated, enslaved, or driven into the wastes of Siberia. This was not merely a war for territory. It was a crusade, a racial and ideological annihilation of what he termed Judeo-Bolshevism. In his mind, the Soviet Union was a corrupt, fragile edifice, led by an inferior race and propped up by a bankrupt ideology. It was a house of cards, waiting for one firm kick. This dangerous conviction was supercharged by the stunning events of 1940. The Blitzkrieg had torn through France and the Low Countries in a matter of weeks. The Wehrmacht, a machine of seemingly unstoppable power, had achieved what the Kaiser's imperial army had failed to do in 4 years of grinding slaughter. An intoxicating sense of invincibility now permeated the German high command. They saw themselves as martial demigods, their panzers as the new cavalry of the apocalypse. They studied maps of the vast Soviet interior, not with trepidation, but with an engineer's arrogance, plotting vectors of attack and calculating timetables for victory. They planned for a war of 3 months, a summer campaign. They believed their own propaganda. Arrogance is a fortress with no back door. While Hitler dreamed of conquest, Joseph Stalin was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The Soviet dictator inhabited a world of shadows and whispers, a fortress of suspicion built brick by brick during the Great Purge of the 1930s. Haunted by the specter of internal enemies, he had systematically decapitated his own military. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a brilliant and forward-thinking strategist, was executed along with 7 other top commanders. In the years that followed, the purges tore through the Red Army's officer corps. 3 of the 5 marshals, 90% of the Army's generals, and 8 of its 9 admirals were arrested. Tens of thousands of officers, the institutional memory and beating heart of the Army, were shot or sent to the Gulag. They were replaced by men whose primary qualification was not competence, but unwavering, terrified loyalty. The Red Army of 1941 was an army with its brain removed, a nervous system shot through with fear. Initiative was a crime. Independent thought was treason. This internal paranoia made Stalin strategic blind to the external threat. He received a steady stream of credible warnings about Hitler's impending invasion. His master spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, provided the exact date. Winston Churchill, now a desperate ally of convenience, sent personal alerts. His own border guards reported the massive, unmistakable buildup of German divisions, the stockpiling of ammunition, the construction of pontoon bridges along the Bug River. Stalin dismissed it all. He saw it as a complex British provocation, a plot to trick him into a premature war with Germany. He could not fathom that Hitler would be so reckless as to open a 2-front war. His mind, so adept at conspiracy, failed to grasp the simple, brutal clarity of his rival's fanaticism. He trusted the word of a fellow dictator over the overwhelming evidence before him. He saw the world not as it was, but as his own paranoia dictated it must be.
And so, 2 tyrants, driven by opposing delusions, were set on a collision course, one blinded by hubris, the other by distrust, one preparing for the easiest victory of his career, the other refusing to believe a war was even coming. In the pre-dawn hours of June 22nd, 1941, the illusion shattered. 3.5 million men of the Axis powers, thousands of tanks, and a sky full of aircraft surged across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The roar of engines and the crump of artillery sounded like the tearing of a map. For the unprepared soldiers of the Red Army, it was a cataclysm. Communications were cut almost instantly. Airfields were obliterated with hundreds of Soviet aircraft destroyed on the ground before they could even take flight. The surprise was absolute, the shock profound. Lieutenant General Ivan Boldin, commander of the 6th Mechanized Corps, would later capture the sheer disbelief of that moment in his memoirs. "We simply couldn't believe it," he wrote. An attack of this magnitude was unthinkable after the pact. In the first weeks, Hitler's gamble appeared to be a staggering success. German panzer divisions knifed through the disorganized Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were swept into vast pockets, becoming prisoners of war. Cities fell. The road to Moscow seemed wide open. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters, Hitler reveled in the news, assuring his generals that the war was already won. The racially inferior state, as he had predicted, was collapsing under the first blow. But while German newsreels showed endless columns of triumphant soldiers, a different drama was unfolding in the deep, silent corridors of the Kremlin. Stalin, the man of steel, had buckled. For nearly 2 weeks, he retreated into a state of shock, a near total collapse of will, isolating himself at his dacha outside Moscow. He issued no orders. He made no speeches. The Soviet Union was rudderless as the greatest invasion force in history chewed through its territory. But this was not the end of his story. It was the prelude to a terrifying transformation. From the depths of his despair, Stalin was about to make a decision. It was not a decision that could be found on any military map. It was a decision that would unleash a force of primal fury, a scorched earth resistance that would turn the landscape itself into a weapon. It would set the stage for a conflict of unimaginable brutality, a kind of war the Wehrmacht with all its technical prowess and tactical brilliance, could never have conceived of. What was that decision, forged in the silence of one man's breakdown? And how did this single choice, made in the heart of the darkness, signal the true, agonizing beginning of the end for Operation Barbarossa?
The plan, codified as Directive 21, was given a name steeped in Teutonic legend, Operation Barbarossa. It was intended to be the ultimate expression of blitzkrieg, a masterpiece of operational art. The concept was seductively simple. 3 massive army groups would smash across the Soviet frontier. Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states towards Leningrad. Army Group South would seize the agricultural heartland of Ukraine and push towards the Caucasus oil fields. And in the center, the most powerful of them all, Army Group Center, would thrust directly towards the ideological and political heart of the enemy, Moscow. The primary objective was not the occupation of territory, but the annihilation of the Red Army. German planners envisioned a series of brilliant encirclements west of the Dwina and Dnieper rivers, trapping and destroying the bulk of Soviet forces in the first few weeks. Once the Red Army was shattered as a coherent fighting force, the state itself, they believed, would simply disintegrate. Moscow would fall before the autumn rains began. The war would be over by Christmas. This entire edifice was built upon a fatal assumption, a strategic delusion that would condemn millions to their deaths, the short war illusion. The German High Command, intoxicated by its recent victories in the West, planned for a summer campaign and nothing more. The logistical chains were stretched to their breaking point, calculated to support a rapid advance of only a few hundred miles before needing to pause. There was no plan B. There was no contingency for a war that lasted into 1942. The quartermasters issued no winter uniforms, no winter-grade lubricants for the engines and machine guns were stockpiled. No thought was given to what would happen when the panzers, the gleaming symbols of German power, encountered the 2 primordial Russian generals that had defeated Napoleon, General Mudd and General Winter. It was a failure of imagination on a history-altering scale. Field Marshal Fyodor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, sensed the deep, underlying danger. As his tanks prepared to roll, he reportedly quipped to a staff officer, "We are driving a Rolls-Royce into a bog. It will get stuck." The German intelligence assessment of their opponent was even more flawed, poisoned by the very ideology that fueled the invasion. They saw the Soviet Union through a distorted lens of racial prejudice. The Slav was deemed an Untermensch, an inferior being, incapable of sophisticated warfare or prolonged resistance. They grossly, catastrophically underestimated Soviet industrial capacity and, most critically, their colossal reserves of manpower. German intelligence estimated the Red Army had around 200 divisions. The true number was well over 300, with the ability to mobilize millions more from the vast, unseen depths of the country east of the Urals. The Germans were preparing to fight the army they could see on the border. They had no concept of the nation they were about to awaken. This wasn't merely a military campaign, it was a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. The infamous Commissar Order, issued before the invasion, instructed German troops to summarily execute all captured Soviet political officers. It was a directive that erased the line between soldier and murderer, transforming a war of conquest into an exterminatory crusade. This ideological fanaticism created a strategic blindness. It convinced the German leadership that pragmatism was unnecessary, that sheer Teutonic will could overcome any obstacle. They saw what they wanted to see, a rotten structure ready to collapse.
Yet even within this maelstrom of confusion, a different, more resilient strategic mind was at work. Figures like General Georgy Zhukov, recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, understood the folly of trying to meet the Wehrmacht head-on. Zhukov argued for a strategy that was anathema to Stalin's aggressive instincts, defense in depth. He advocated for giving up territory, for trading space for time. The plan was to let the German spearheads punch deep into the Soviet interior, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point, all while the Red Army fell back to more defensible lines, marshaling its immense reserves for a winter counteroffensive. It was a brutal calculus, sacrificing land and lives in the short term to preserve the army and the state in the long term. This thinking laid the groundwork for the policy that would come to define Soviet resistance: scorched earth.
As the Red Army retreated, it was to destroy everything of value. Bridges were to be blown, railways torn up, crops burned, livestock slaughtered, factories dismantled and shipped east. The invader would inherit a wasteland, a vast empty expanse that offered no food, no shelter, and no fuel. The land itself was to become a weapon. The contrast between the two belligerents was stark. On one side, German operational brilliance was shackled to utter strategic blindness. Their tactical execution in the opening weeks was nearly flawless, but it served a grand strategy based on fantasy. On the other, the Soviets suffered from initial tactical chaos, yet they possessed an immense, untapped human and industrial potential, coupled with the dawning of a strategy that, while horrific in its human cost, was perfectly suited to the realities of the war they now faced. In the summer sun of 1941, none of this seemed to matter. The initial German victories were breathtaking, seeming to validate every one of Hitler's predictions. The panzer divisions sliced through the brittle Soviet lines like a scalpel. At Minsk and then at Smolensk, they closed enormous pockets, trapping hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. The columns of defeated men shuffling into captivity seemed endless. By September, another colossal encirclement at Kiev would net the Germans over 600,000 prisoners. Vast territories were overrun. To the outside world, and to the Germans themselves, it looked like an unstoppable triumph. The road to Moscow appeared clear, but the victories were deceptive. Every mile the panzers advanced, their supply lines grew longer and more fragile. Every mile cost them fuel, ammunition, and mechanical wear that could not be easily replaced. The vast distances were a sponge, soaking up men and materiel. The infantry divisions, marching on foot, struggled to keep up with the tanks, leaving the flanks of the armored spearheads dangerously exposed to pockets of bypassed Soviet resistance that now began to form partisan bands. The Rolls-Royce was indeed driving deeper and deeper into the bog. Beneath the surface of this seemingly unstoppable advance, beneath the thunder of the guns and the triumphant newsreels, a silent, deadly enemy was already gathering strength. It was an enemy far more formidable than any tank division, an enemy of terrain, of distance, of mud, and of cold. An enemy Hitler, in his ideological fervor, had completely ignored. What was this elemental force? And how would it conspire with the will of a desperate people to turn the tide of human history? Looking back with the clarity of hindsight, one wonders what single piece of advice a German general could have given his Führer. What simple truth, whispered in the halls of power in the spring of 1941, might have prevented the entire Barbarossa blunder.
The climax of Operation Barbarossa exploded across a front of nearly 2,000 miles. It was a war of three distinct fates, three colossal spearheads aimed at the heart of a continent. In the north, Army Group North, under Field Marshal von Lieb, pushed relentlessly through the Baltic states, its steel fingers closing around the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, Leningrad. There, it would initiate one of the most brutal and protracted sieges in the whole of human history, a slow, merciless strangulation designed to starve a city of millions into submission. To the south, the panzers of Field Marshal von Rundstedt's Army Group South plunged into the black earth of Ukraine, the coveted breadbasket of the Soviet Union. Their objective was the rich agricultural lands, the industrial basin of the Donets, and ultimately the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. It was a war for resources, for the fuel that would feed the Nazi war machine for 1,000 years. But it was in the center where the true drama, the ideological core of the invasion, played out. Army Group Center, the most powerful concentration of military force ever assembled, represented the very beating heart of Hitler's ambition. Commanded by Field Marshal von Bock, its 60 divisions, its thousands of tanks and aircraft, had one singular, all-consuming objective: Moscow. The city was more than a capital. It was a symbol. To capture it was to decapitate the Soviet state, to tear the heart from the body of Bolshevism and hold it aloft for the world to see. In the heavy days of summer, as German columns kicked up plumes of fine white dust on the endless march east, this goal seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Then the world began to change. The seasons turned, and the very ground beneath their feet declared war.
The dust of summer, which had choked engines and caked the faces of exhausted infantrymen, gave way to a new enemy. The autumn rains came. The Russians have a word for it, Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads. The dirt tracks that served as the arteries for the German advance dissolved into vast, primordial seas of mud. It was a thick, clay-like, axle-deep mire that possessed a malevolent, grasping power. It swallowed trucks whole. It chained tanks to the earth, turning them into helpless, static pillboxes. Horses, the forgotten prime movers of the supposedly mechanized Wehrmacht, strained and died in their harnesses, their bodies left to sink into the muck. The Blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed and movement, was paralyzed. The advance slowed from miles per day to yards per hour, and then, in some places, it stopped altogether. Every can of fuel, every box of ammunition, every loaf of bread had to be fought for, dragged through a quagmire that seemed to stretch to the horizon. And then, the mud froze. As November gave way to December, the true Russian winter descended. It came not as a gentle snow, but as a predator. It was a cold that was alien to the German experience, a soul-crushing, invasive cold that found its way through the threadbare greatcoats of men who had been promised a summer victory. Temperatures plunged to 30, then 40, then 50 degrees below zero. It was a cold that turned steel brittle. Machine guns jammed as the lubricating oil congealed into thick grease. Artillery shells refused to fire. The diesel fuel for the panzers turned to gel, rendering the mighty tanks inert monuments of ice-sheathed steel. Men learned the agony of cold-weather mechanics, trying to coax engines to life with blowtorches, their bare hands sticking to the frozen metal. They lit fires under their vehicles, a desperate gamble that often ended with the entire truck and its precious cargo consumed in flames. The land itself offered no comfort. Imagine the relentless, percussive drone of distant artillery, a sound that became the permanent backdrop to existence. Imagine the bitter, metallic taste of frozen rations, chipped away with a bayonet and thawed slowly in one's mouth. Imagine the sight of burning villages, torched by retreating Soviets or desperate Germans, scarring the endless snow-covered plains, the only points of light and warmth in a universe of white and gray. A German soldier from the 258th Infantry Division, writing home in a letter that would be his last, captured the despair that had replaced the arrogance of June. He wrote, "Our weapons froze, our vehicles froze, our men froze." This was not war. This was hell.
This was the logistical nightmare made real. The German High Command had planned a war against an army. They found themselves in a war against geography. They had to supply an enormous force across vast, roadless expanses, serviced by a railway system of a different gauge and harassed constantly by the growing threat of partisans who rose from the forests and swamps. The challenge of maintaining supply lines over such extended distances against a hostile environment and a resisting population is a timeless vulnerability in warfare. Strategy is bound by the laws of physics. Ambition cannot conjure fuel from frozen earth. The German war machine, for all its tactical brilliance, was being bled dry by 1,000 logistical cuts, starved by the very vastness of the land it sought to conquer. Yet they pushed on, fueled by little more than discipline and grim determination. By December of 1941, the German spearheads had reached the absolute limit of their endurance. One reconnaissance battalion penetrated the Moscow suburb of Khimki, a mere 5 miles from the city limits. From the hills near Krasnaya Polyana, officers using powerful field glasses could make out the faint onion-domed spires of the Kremlin, glistening in the weak winter sun. Victory, the prize for which they had sacrificed everything, seemed to be there. Right there, just beyond their grasp. The city was in a panic. The Soviet government was evacuating. The end felt near. But it was an illusion. The men who saw the spires of Moscow were ghosts. They were the exhausted survivors of divisions that had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Their tanks were frozen, their supplies were gone, and their bodies were failing. The Nazi war machine had not paused. It had reached its breaking point. It had lunged for the enemy's throat, and in the process, its heart had given out. And it was at this precise moment, the moment of Germany's maximum exertion and ultimate vulnerability, that the Soviets struck. Just as the Wehrmacht shuddered to a final frozen halt, a powerful counterattack was unleashed. It came not from the battered armies the Germans had been fighting for months, but from the frozen depths of Siberia and the Soviet Far East, a force Hitler's intelligence services never even knew existed. They came as an apparition out of the blizzards, fresh, fully equipped divisions clad in white winter camouflage, riding on T-34 tanks whose wide tracks glided over the snow that had crippled the German panzers. These were men born to the cold, soldiers for whom this hellish winter was simply home. The shock to the German front lines was absolute. For soldiers on the verge of collapse who believed they were facing a defeated enemy, this sudden, ferocious assault by a seemingly new army was a psychological cataclysm. The offensive, commanded by General Georgy Zhukov, slammed into the exposed flanks of Army Group Center with terrifying force. The German retreat, when it began, was not orderly. It was a desperate scramble for survival, harassed by the Siberian ski troops who moved like phantoms through the frozen forests. The tide had not just turned, a dam had broken. This counterattack would not only save Moscow, it would save the Soviet Union, and in the process, it would forever shatter the myth of German invincibility. The question that echoed through the halls of the Wolf's Lair, and which has echoed through history ever since, was profound. How? How did Stalin, a leader who had brought his own army to the brink of ruin, pull off this impossible feat? What was this hidden reserve of power, this secret weapon that he had held back until the final desperate hour?
The Battle of Moscow was more than a defeat. It was a verdict. In the frozen trenches and blasted suburbs of the Soviet capital, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered forever. The dream of a quick victory, born in the arrogance of June, died a frozen death in the snows of December. It was here that the conflict on the Eastern Front became the irreversible turning point, not just for Barbarossa, but for Germany's entire war. The human cost on both sides was devastating, initiating a brutal war of attrition, a relentless grinding of men and machines that Germany, with its finite resources, could never hope to win. The grim reality of a protracted two-front war had replaced the fantasy of a swift summer campaign. Looking back from the precipice of this disaster, Hitler's key mistakes were legion, each one compounding the others. The first and most catastrophic was a failure of the imagination, a profound underestimation of Soviet strength, resilience, and industrial capacity. German intelligence had counted the divisions on the border. They had failed to count the soul of a nation. They believed that once the frontier armies were destroyed, the state would collapse. They never conceived that the Soviets could absorb such staggering losses, millions of men killed or captured in the opening months, and still field new, fully equipped armies, raised from the deep interior and manufactured east beyond the Ural Mountains. This miscalculation was directly linked to a logistical failure of epic proportions. The German war machine was built for short, sharp wars on the dense road networks of Western Europe. It was completely unsuited for the vast distances and primitive infrastructure of the Soviet Union. The panzer divisions outran their own supply lines, which were stretched to the breaking point over thousands of miles of dirt tracks. The vastness of the land was a sponge that soaked up fuel, ammunition, and men. When the autumn rains turned the earth to a grasping quagmire, the Blitzkrieg doctrine itself drowned in mud. Strategy is bound by the laws of physics. Ambition cannot conjure fuel from frozen earth. This was compounded by the inexcusable neglect of winter preparedness. Planning for a war of weeks, the German High Command had issued no winter uniforms, no cold weather lubricants for engines and weapons. When the temperature plummeted, The army froze. Men suffered from frostbite in their summer weight coats, their fingers sticking to the frigid steel of their rifles. Engines refused to start. Machine guns jammed solid. The German army, the most modern fighting force in the world, was being systematically dismantled by an enemy as old as time itself, the Russian winter.
But the greatest failure was not logistical or even strategic. It was moral and intellectual. At the very core of the Barbarossa blunder was Hitler's ideological blindness. His fanatical belief that the Slavic peoples were Untermenschen, subhuman, was the poison that corrupted every calculation. It led to flawed intelligence that dismissed Soviet industrial and military potential. It fostered a strategic arrogance that made pragmatism impossible and viewed compromise as weakness. The war he launched was not merely for territory, but for annihilation. And this genocidal fury blinded him to the most basic realities of the conflict he had initiated. He saw what his prejudice demanded he see, a rotten structure ready to collapse under the first kick. The lesson from Barbarossa is therefore clear, and it is timeless. Hubris in military planning, driven by ideology rather than a sober assessment of reality, often leads directly to ruin. The staggering overconfidence that allowed Hitler to believe the Soviet Union would crumble in weeks is a permanent warning against underestimating an adversary and failing to adapt to the hard facts on the ground. The failure to contend with the fundamental environmental and logistical challenges of the Eastern Front serves as a potent reminder for any military planner today. Neglect the fundamentals, and even the most formidable army can be crippled. But even as his armies reeled back from Moscow, leaving a trail of frozen dead and abandoned equipment in the snow, Hitler refused to admit defeat. A lesser leader might have sought a way out, a negotiated peace. Hitler, a prisoner of his own myth, saw the setback not as a consequence of his own flawed strategy, but as a failure of will. He would not retreat. He would not reconsider. He would double down. He would commit even more of Germany's precious resources to the Eastern Front, convinced that a final, decisive blow could still win the war. This decision would lead to an even more devastating confrontation in the summer of 1942, culminating in a battle so brutal, so utterly cataclysmic, that it would forever be etched in history as the true graveyard of the Sixth Army. A battle we will explore in our next epic saga. What was this battle? And how did it seal Germany's fate?
Operation Barbarossa wasn't just a battle. It was the genesis of the most brutal front in history, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and a chilling testament to the unimaginable cost of ideological fanaticism. It forever changed the course of the Second World War. The takeaways from this colossal blunder are simple yet profound. First, hubris is a killer. Hitler's fatal flaw wasn't just strategic, it was his ideological arrogance that blinded him to reality. This arrogance led directly to the second lesson: logistics wins wars. The German High Command, in their contempt for the enemy, created a brilliant plan of attack with no realistic plan for supply. The most powerful army is useless if it cannot be fed, fueled, and armed. Finally, the resilience of the defended. They fatally underestimated an enemy fighting for its very existence. The Germans saw a corrupt state they believed would shatter with one firm kick. They failed to see a people who would refuse to break, a people who would trade space for time and blood for survival. Next time, we dive deeper into the abyss, exploring the battle that truly broke the Wehrmacht, Stalingrad. Get ready for an unvarnished look at human endurance and strategic folly on an unimaginable scale. If you are gripped by the monumental blunders of Barbarossa, hit that like button, share this video with fellow history fanatics, and subscribe for more bombshell revelations from history's greatest conflicts. And tell me in the comments, what do you think was Hitler's absolute worst mistake in Barbarossa? Let's discuss.